everybody. Welcome back to the Popcorn Square. We're going old school today. All right, but first, Kage, I have to ask you a question. Do you like movies about gladiators?
Yeah.
All right. That, of course, harkens to one of my favorite movies back in the old days. That's the 80s. That's Airplane. Joke doesn't really hit as hard for the audience members who haven't seen it yet. So please, if there's any movie from the 80s that you must see, it is Airplane. We'll also accept Airplane 2. But today's episode, we're going to talk about all of those great movies that maybe, were favorites, or movies that we saw later in life. I don't think anybody here can really talk about going to see an original 70s movie. So that's going to be, these are going to be, recommendations that we heard, little gems we found along the way. And of course, for our 90s audience, the ones that we did see in the original in theaters. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with just a couple of my favorites. And then we'll get into, some of the movies that we might have really enjoyed and wouldn't mind seeing a remake, and maybe even touch on the ones that they did remake and they shouldn't have. But I'm going to go in the 70s. For me, it's going to have to be kind of like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That one I loved. You're going to have some really good sci-fi movies that were out there, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, kind of a little bit of, I think, what was it, Invasions of the Body Snatchers, things like that came out that were great sci-fi movies. The original Superman, that was towards the end of the, of the 70s, or maybe it was even in the
I think
it was either early 80s or late 70s. I think it might have been like 79, 78. And then, of course, moving on to the 80s, you're going to have Airplane, Adventures in Babysitting. I mean, these were movies that, I watched. I was born late 80s, so, these are ones that I usually either watched on television where they edit it for content and length. And then I was like, man, I love these so much. I'm going to go out and find a way to watch the full version. Another good one, that a lot of us know would be Fish Called Wanda, My Cousin Vinny, I think might have been 90s. Birdcage, I think was also in the 90s. But, some of these great movies that come out that started to push the boundaries as well as what was acceptable. And, that had to do, of course, with a lot of the politics and changes that went on in the 80s as well, as far as what was acceptable to see in cinema and not just, shut down immediately by, the church and more religious viewers and things like that. But of course, in the 90s, it would probably be like anything Disney
Right.
as well. But let's go to Neff. Let's hear your list of some of your favorites.
So going back from the 70s, I have Godfather Part 1, and then Godfather Part 2, I think came out 3 to 4 years after that. Godfather Part 1 came out in 1972. If anybody doesn't know about that, great movie, you need to watch that. Classic. Follows the Corleone family, Vito Corleone, number one. And then it just kind of shows the progression throughout that family and the mafia. They're one of the 5 families. Of course, the 5 families are different. It's basically fictional, right? But it's based upon the real mafia, right? So they're part of the 5 families in New York, right? And it follows the Corleone family, right? And then you go into Godfather Part 2, where you see Michael become the head of the family, and then you see a lot of things that transpire with that. But those two from the 70s, to me, really stick out as some of the best movies from the 70s. I'm going to jump a little bit to the 90s. But before I do that, I'm going to throw Predator in there for the 80s. That's going to be the 80s one that I throw in there that we kind of haven't talked about in too much detail. We did talk about it with the whole Aliens episode, but the Predator in there, 1987. And then I'm going to kind of hit the 90s here. I have Basic Instinct. The Matrix, of course, Casino, Terminator 2, specifically Terminator 2. And that was just a couple in there, you know what I mean? But I'll run through some of the numbers for these. I think this is very interesting, and especially because we talked about box office for movies that were, older, and then now when we talked about the originals versus remakes. But Godfather Part 1, 7.2 million to make, and it had a box office of 291 million. Right now, this movie's been out for about 40, 50 years, so it's had time to still make money.
That's
Funny enough, they're
cumulative.
actually showing it in theaters now, kind of like Tuesday Classic Films. I think Harkins is doing that, so that's interesting there. Godfather Part 2, 13 million, and made 93. Box office success, but didn't make as much as the first one. Basic Instinct, 49 million to make, right? And it made 352 million. So that's a blockbuster right there. Matrix Classic, 63 million, made 467 million. Terminator 2, 94 million, and made 520 million. And then Casino, 40 million, and made 116 million, right? So these are just some classic films from those eras that I threw out there. Of course, there's a lot more that I could throw in there, and a lot more that we've already talked about, so I don't need to go over that. But that's just a list for me. Kage?
So I won't lie to you, I was born in the early 80s, and there's not too many 70s stuff I know of that I saw. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is Alien, the very first Aliens film that came out in 79.
Yeah. So right on the cusp there, but still,
right on the cusp.
Still, we'll count
squeezes
it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Well, I know it's not a movie, but here's a fun fact. Back in the day, back in '83 or whatever, I watched the Batman series, okay? Now, listen carefully. I said the Batman series in the 80s. When I was a kid, I used to watch the Adam West version of Batman that would play on TV. Now, by the way, it was already old at that point, but I was a kid, I didn't know. And I ate it all up. I was all for it. You know, you hit somebody and it goes pow on the screen. I absolutely loved that. Then the Tim Burton Batman came out.
1989.
1989, and that is one that I will speak on there. That was on my list, actually.
Michael Keaton, Batman Forever.
Yes. And Batman Returns, that's where it's at.
No, I just mean he is my Batman Forever.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely, 100%.
Not the movie Batman Forever.
I was
just...
like, no, the bat nips on the suit?
No, I said not the
Just
movie,
making
not Batman Forever, the movie. Michael Keaton, people. I just want him to be Batman Forever.
It's okay. I feel you. I'm right there with you. Yeah. So for 80s, I want to say, I mentioned in a previous episode The Thing from 1982. I'm a huge Ghostbusters fan. Yeah, Ghostbusters from '84 and Ghostbusters 2 from 1989, both really great films that I will still watch to this day. I absolutely love those movies. I love the giant Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, or the Ghostbusters using the Statue of freaking Liberty to save the city. I mean, who else is going to come up with that? You know, it was so cool. Batman and Batman Returns, again, we just mentioned that. Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice is a big one for me.
You only got one more time. Don't do it.
I know, right? Oh. Beetlejuice. No.
Damn it! No,
Let's get this party started, folks. So yeah, and I know they're bringing that back. So they're bringing Keaton back. So let's hope for good things, you guys. And then of course Ninja Turtles. Ninja Turtles, the first two movies. The third one, where they went back in time, that got a little weird. I still watched it when I was a kid. I enjoyed it for what it was. But as far as nostalgia factor and going back and watch, I will always watch
1 and 2.
1 and 2. I love I think some scenes that come out to my mind from that is when they talk to Master Splinter and the campfire. They had it's a good time. It's comedy, but they had that one serious moment where they kind of lost their way a little bit, and they got a vision of Master Splinter telling them, you guys got to come together. So I really like that. And of course, in part 2, you have Go Ninja, Go Ninja, Go. Yeah, that's right, folks. You're welcome. I am very, very old. I'm going to go pick my retirement home. Thank you very much. From the 90s, though, we have Independence Day. I love Independence Day.
Oh.
We won't talk about the second one, just pretend that didn't happen. But the first one was fantastic. I remember seeing that back in 1996. Excellent film. What do you want from us? What is it that you want us to do? Die. I mean, that was just so epic. And then, of course, on the comedy side of things, I'm going to say a lot of Jim Carrey films. The Mask.
Cable Guy.
Cable Guy, Liar, Liar, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective 1 and 2, The Height.
What about Dumb and Dumber?
Of course, Dumb and Dumber. Of course,
Like,
Dumb
we're
and
going to
Dumber.
bring up Jim Carrey. You
Yeah,
can't
no, I mean,
forget
like, the
Dumb and Dumber.
90s was his era, you know, I think, in movies. All of his movies were a great time. And then, of course, Disney has a ton of them. I think Aladdin and Lion King were I would argue maybe my favorite Disney films of all time in the 90s. I can still watch those to this day.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm definitely gonna, if we're going more kind of like the kid-friendly stuff, Nightmare Before Christmas is probably my number one,
Cult
right?
Yeah.
And Bad Boys is in there for me. I was gonna say Independence Day
Not
too.
Lion King?
Lion King, of course, is in there, but I was just focused on more like adult-oriented stuff. But if we go into kids stuff, I can go on a whole list about that. Of course, Lion King is in there. Like,
yeah.
of course. What else? Independence Day I was gonna throw that one in there, and then Men in Black. I thought Men in Black 1 was awesome.
Yeah,
sure.
Men in Black, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that was
a couple others, you know, since we were going to talk a little bit about budgets, I can't fail to mention some of the biggest heavy hitters, you know, like in the 80s and 90s, would have been Back to the Future and Home Alone. I mean, Back to the Future, you're talking about a budget of $19 million, and it ended up grossing like $333 million.
Wow.
Home Alone, again, $18 million. $476 million. I mean, total. You really have to give it to some of these movies that were just kind of off the wall. Nobody thought these movies were really going to make any money. They were like testing the waters. I mean, you had these heavy hitting movies that had decent budgets behind them that they thought were going to make, you know, a good amount of money. And some of these, you're just sitting there going like, hey, look at this. We made so much freaking money. And they spawned, I should say, multiple sequels, and such a big, heavy amount of, you know, history and culture and, you know, effects that it had on most of its audience members. It's like everybody knew them, you know. They're like, you have seen it, right? Like you could live under a rock and you still knew what they were. There's no way you didn't know about these movies.
I feel like a lot of the movies that we listed here, again, these are subjective. The audiences out there, you guys, I'm sure you have your own favorites. Maybe you absolutely hate what we said, whatever. But that's the fun of the podcast is, you know, everyone share what's your favorites, you know?
Right.
I think there's a huge nostalgia factor. Just like you said, I think it's also part of American pop culture, I think. Batman, Ghostbusters, Home Alone, those are so ingrained. You talk to anybody, I don't care what fan you are, everybody knows what those are. There's parents our age showing their kids Home Alone with Macaulay Culkin, you know, and if I was a parent, I would do an exact same thing.
Well, right, and talk about movies that are going to span multiple generations, regardless of when they were made, and they're still doing reboots and remakes of these. You're talking about James Bond. You're talking about, you know, Batman. You're talking about now Spider-Man. You know, nobody brought up the '90s Spider-Man, but that was big. You know, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man.
Was that late '90s, like '99 when the first one came out?
So the first Spider-Man, I think, was '98, maybe.
Wow.
I
That
feel
first
like-
Spider-Man holds up really well, and it's actually underrated when I compare it to the Spider-Man stuff we see now. I was just talking to someone about the fight choreography in that first Spider-Man. Out of this world. Like, it was amazing fight choreography. And the fact that they used very little CG. You know, the suit was real. I think I sent Kage a meme where the eyes weren't even.
I remember that.
It was very interesting. But yeah, a couple other ones. Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket. That's a couple just to name out there that are just Dynamite Classics. Any information, Kage, on any of the budgets and box offices of some of those movies that you listed?
Unfortunately, I did not have time to find that
Interesting.
this week, but yeah.
Give us some details about some of those movies that you
Like
picked
what
out.
made it so great, yeah. Oh,
Just like two or three.
Real quick, I'm wrong.
What you got, Buttons?
I'm wrong. Spider-Man,
2001,
Tobey Maguire,
right?
2002.
2002, yeah.
2002.
Right,
Sorry, my
right.
childhood, I failed
Yeah,
you.
it was not the 90s.
You didn't feel me.
It was not 90s. It felt like the 90s.
It's okay.
But no, it was 2002. It was I was still a kid, so like, I feel
Well,
like
this
that
is a
counts.
nostalgia episode, so I'm going to allow it. It's okay. For me, some of the biggest movies that I feel like, and now I'm going to get deep here, folks, that have had a big role in my upbringing, actually, is Ghostbusters. You've heard me talk in previous episodes where I talk about, my love of horror and dark stuff. It's not all I watch, but it kind of comes from my early years of life, watching Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice. I gravitated towards that. My very first Tim Burton film, a lot of people, I think, don't know, is that Batman from 1989 was actually directed by Tim Burton. That's why it has kind of dark elements. That's why when you have Batman Returns up there with Danny DeVito, it's been made through. Wow. Okay, so that's
That's the first
yeah.
Ghostbusters.
So
here.
Ghostbusters. Thank you, Buttons. The very first Ghostbusters movie had a $30 million budget, but it grossed approximately $240 million in the United States alone, and over $50 million during its theatrical run. I'd say that's a pretty good success. But those movies.
Yeah, that was 50 million abroad, so that was not including the U.S. So
Incredible. Incredible. And so I'd say Batman and Ghostbusters, Beetlejuice, and Ninja Turtles, that sums up my personality, I think, because I've always been into martial arts. Batman was my first superhero movie, and because I watch those paranormal, hokey things, that's why that stuff doesn't bother me these days, is because my introduction to paranormal anything was Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice. You know what I mean? So those are very near and dear to my heart. But of course, I like to laugh. So a lot of, if not all of the Jim Carrey movies from the 90s are me. I think growing up, I apologize to my friends, I probably quoted so many movies just in my day-to-day Jim Carrey movies. Absolutely love him as an actor.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I'll throw E.T. in there as well. That was a pretty big one,
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
I kind of went over Godfather 1 and 2. A lot of people have seen The Matrix. That's kind of a depthy. I can't really go into that quickly, right? The Matrix
not
is
an
so
easy-
psychological and so ahead of its time. But Basic Instinct, it kind of follows a detective who's following these murders, leads him to a lady, right? And he can't quite pinpoint who's doing the murders, but he feels it's her. The evidence isn't there. She's playing psychological mind games on him, and she's attractive too. So he's kind of getting a little too close to home and intertwined with her. He's got another. There's another female character in there. I don't want to say she's his. She's like kind of like his superior in a sense, right? But she's not like the chief of the department, right? But he has a relationship with her as well. So this guy is kind of like going through it. He's fighting with alcohol and stuff like that. He's got this attractive lady that he thinks is the killer. And then he got his boss over here who he's in a relationship with, right? Mm-hmm. So just a real interesting like 90s nostalgic movie. And of course Sharon Stone's in there. It has that infamous scene where she's being interrogated and she opens her legs. Everybody's like, what? Right, so yeah, Basic Instinct. What a great movie. What a great movie, right?
You're like, I was all for it. I was like, yeah, this is great.
So yeah, that's just, a couple bits of information for those. Terminator 2, classic, right? Mm-hmm. Arnold Schwarzenegger. They really took the story to a different level there. I think that's really when Terminator kicked the doors down.
Yes,
Terminator 2.
you are absolutely
and still holds up now, even the special effects. So.
And that is definitely an example of, where a sequel is actually more enjoyable than the first movie in the series. Now, I think we've kind of went over a lot of our favorites from the different, different time periods, but Neff, I'll start with you. any of those movies you mentioned, would you want to see a remake? You know, a reboot, a remake, a reimagining even?
See, for those, and that's great you brought that up because that's a topic as well. I think those you need to kind of leave those alone. I think with Basic Instinct you can play around with that. It's a good movie, but I don't think people kind of hold it up as like a.
Should we do a
like
gender swap? Do we want to see a man
Oh
spread?
yeah, you never know. What if they turn it into like a comedy?
I mean,
Right?
I feel like that, you joke, but I have a
That
feeling
might catch
would
on somewhere.
That might catch on.
Right. Like Basic Instinct, out of all the movies that I really listed on here, I think that's the one that has the most play in between. I think The Godfather 2, you can't really remake that movie. You got so many great actors in that movie. Just
It's
to name
so
two.
iconic.
Right, just to name two, you know, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, like stuff like that. Marlon Brando. I can just keep going. And then Francis Ford, great director, you know what I mean? So it's going to be kind of hard to mess around with that. And I think that's one of those classic movies that people are like, you can't touch this one. Leave it as what it is. We'll bring it back in theaters, you know, we'll bring it back for the anniversary and we'll respect it as it is. The Matrix, you can't necessarily remake The Matrix. Me and Kage have talked about The Matrix Resurrections and how that didn't hold up well. They basically made a mockery out of the whole story. So I think as far as The Matrix goes, I think The Matrix is done. You can't remake it, you know what I mean? Just leave it as what it is. It doesn't need to be remade.
It was really ahead of its time. I don't really think you could remake it if you
Right.
tried.
Terminator, same thing. They're still actually making Terminator films. So as far as talks of even a remake, I just don't even think that happens until they decide, hey, we're not going to make any more of these films. Like something bad would have to happen, like Arnold pass away or something like that. Then maybe a few years after, they might go and visit.
Distance
Let's
is
go
important.
and do this, right? But they're not going to remake a Terminator at this point, I don't believe. You know, same thing with Casino. Like, we don't need to retell that story. And then, two, it's like, when was the height of these mafia-based, you know, movies? I think it was kind of like, you know, 70s, 80s, 90s. We do see some stuff here and there, like The Irishman that came out on Netflix. But I don't know if we've seen a real heavy mafia-based movie out in theaters recently. I can't think of one right now. I know there's other stuff going on, but as far as the Italian mafia, I can't think of a movie that's come out recently in theaters that had a lot of impact.
No,
So,
the only thing I would say that it's not a movie,
Right.
but, you know, something that might have had just as big an impact would have been like The Sopranos.
right, and that was HBO, right?
Right, and
Or was that Showtime?
I
think it's
think it
Show,
was
okay, I don't know. It might have been. It's either HBO or Showtime.
but
But,
it
yeah,
was-
The
it was a
Sopranos, the
series,
series,
yeah.
right? And then they had a little prequel to that as well. Funny enough.
and spin-offs.
Right. So yeah, as
HBO.
far as those, good info, Kage. But as far as those go, I don't think some of those you could touch at all. We talked about other stuff as well. You know, I think it's just specific movies that people are like, this is just at such a level, it's hard to even top it. Don't even attempt it. What do you got, Kage?
You know, it's funny we talk about remakes of our favorite older movies because many of my movies have been remade. As we talked about, The Thing, Ghostbusters, Batman, Beetlejuice is about to be remade, rumored to come out September of this year.
I think that's supposed to be a sequel.
Oh, sequel. Okay.
Yeah,
my bad.
it's a sequel.
My bad. And then of course you have Michael Bay's version of Ninja Turtles. Okay, so I found those ones entertaining.
I think
I
they
was able to watch them,
yeah.
but I feel like the older movies had more heart.
I feel like the newer ones were geared a little bit towards a younger audience. Not that the originals weren't.
Yeah.
I just feel like as an adult, they weren't as enjoyable as they might have been
Yeah.
for a younger audience.
And
Whereas the older ones, I feel like the older audience could enjoy those just as much as a younger audience.
I have a question too, just something to think about. I wonder what our parents thought of those movies, like when they took. Because I can't tell you when I saw Ninja Turtles. I know I saw it in the theaters, but I don't. It was so long ago. I don't remember who I saw it with, exactly what age I was. But I wonder what would our parents say about the movies that we dragged them to as kids. I think one that comes to mind is when I was a kid, I loved Nightmare Before Christmas. My mom, my stepfather hated it so much. And to this day, my mom is like, I don't understand why. And I was like, Mom, it's a cult classic. It's entertaining because it's different. It's entertaining because it's a stop motion film, which there aren't too many of, and there definitely, I don't think there was too many of that back then.
Shout out to Tim Burton.
Shout out to Tim Burton, right. I mean, yeah, in the 60s and 70s, you had those stop motion Christmas, Rudolph the Red, Red-Nosed
Yeah,
Reindeer. Like, you
yeah.
had that, but this was on a different level. It took them years of making the puppets, modeling a frame, taking a picture, and taking a frame, doing that, and then you got to
Yeah.
add the voices over it.
The British had, what was the sheep? Wallace and Gromit.
Oh,
The
Wallace
yeah.
and Gromit's
Cl-
also,
yeah,
yes.
that's a
Yeah.
perfect example. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
making
they
things
use
out
that
of
same-
clay.
yeah.
And I believe did the same artist work on Chicken Run as well?
Yes,
Yep.
yes, it's
Good.
the
No,
same.
that's a great one.
And they did a Pirates movie that wasn't as well received, but it was the same claymation.
Right,
Stop
but-
animation.
But that's the only movie I can think of offhand is Nightmare Before Christmas. I loved it. My parents absolutely hated it. They just could not understand it.
Yeah.
And I wonder what they would say about Ghostbusters or Ninja
That
Turtles.
is definitely an interesting topic, and I will, because I wanted to touch on it in our previous episode, because we were talking about Aladdin, and since you bring it up about that, I remember my dad, telling me when I was younger, he was so mad because my mom took me and my sister to go see Aladdin in theaters, and he was actually looking forward to seeing it. And so he's like, he was telling me, he went and saw the remake of Aladdin. And I asked him because I didn't go in theaters and see it, but my stepmom had wanted to see it, so they went out and watched it, and he enjoyed it. I don't think he enjoyed it as much. He said he didn't enjoy it as much as the original, but he did still like the remake of it with Will Smith. So, I mean, it's interesting that, Kage, that you had brought up that question about what our parents, because some of these movies are great like that. I mean, another one that we didn't mention in here, but I believe this one was in the 90s, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? That was either late 80s or early 90s, I believe. But that one, and as well as several of the Disney movies, they had that, geared audience of children, but they had so much content that nowadays you don't see in children's movies, or it's even more contained to some degree because, it was humor aimed directly at parents who were stuck watching these movies with these kids.
Yeah, oh.
And so it was all like it hit differently. You look at Jessica Rabbit, and that was not for the, the 7-year-olds sitting in the audience. That was not for them.
Yeah.
So I do like the point, Kage, that brought up, like, hey, what are the previous generation who saw the originals of these movies thinking of the remakes if they saw them?
Yeah, our perspective is different as children. We see things when we're kids, and me speaking as a gamer, watching movies, playing games from back then, and then going back and watching them now, and I'm like, I'm gonna love this because I loved it back then. Man, this is crap. What was I thinking? Blah blah blah. I loved GoldenEye on the 64 back in the day. I heard they were bringing it back, but they didn't change the graphics, and I'm like, oh my god, this looks horrible.
Yeah.
It looks absolutely horrible now. And then older movies, and that might be a topic, by the way. Talking about older movies, like what older movies have you seen that you loved back then that you hate now, based on, it could be based on the times we're in, maybe your personality has changed, your tastes, like what's changed? What's a movie that you look at differently now?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like, you could expound greatly on a number of topics of older movies, simply from how the rating system has changed, as well as, the political climate, what's socially acceptable to talk about now, topics.
Yep.
And I mean, we talk about some of my favorite movies like Mel Brooks, and a lot of those came out in the 80s and 90s. I will say they should have been on my list because I love them. But movies like Blazing Saddles and, Young Frankenstein. We've got Robin Hood Men in Tights, Spaceballs. I mean, Spaceballs. How could I leave Spaceballs off? I love Spaceballs.
I love both of those. Robin Hood Men in Tights and Spaceballs. Let's go.
Yeah, but I mean, Mel Brooks, he was not afraid to bring on topics and discuss things that, other studios kind of looked the other way or never really brought up, and even just the hypocrisy of Hollywood in general. And nowadays, the culture and the climate, for Hollywood and cinema in general, they have to be real careful, because cancel culture is a real thing. And you look at a lot of these movies that are older and you go, those would not be acceptable today. Those would, and some of that makes them so great because of that. You're like, hey, I can sit down and watch Blazing Saddles and enjoy all the comedy in there, and know that if they did a remake of it, it would not be the same, because they wouldn't be allowed to make the same kind of
Right.
film.
I was watching Hot Shots and I saw a couple
yeah, Hot
lines in
Shots,
there. I was
yeah.
just like, that wouldn't slide.
I mean, even a classic one, Neff. I know you love Major Payne.
I love Major Payne too.
Yeah, Kage. So, I mean, Major Payne, they'd be like, oh, what are they doing to those poor kids? That's, they're making them run around in dresses. That's terrible.
Bubba, your
Like,
legs
so
ain't
many,
there, and his little nubs start kicking.
I mean, just so many things that were great about the movies in our childhoods, and, they're not socially acceptable anymore. But you can still go out there and find these gems, people. You can still, introduce them to your kids and be like, hey, things were different back then, and it was okay to laugh at these jokes.
Right.
You can't laugh at them anymore, but you can watch them at home and laugh all you want.
What do you guys think makes a film a classic subjectively?
So, Neff, that's a good question. I mean, as far as, making it classic, to me, I'm about watchability. Can I rewatch
Wow.
this? Can I enjoy it when I was 7 and still enjoy it at 37? Is it something that I would have my kids watch? You got to watch this. This is the best movie ever. This was my childhood. It still holds up. Please watch it. Don't make fun of me. But I feel like it's a classic. If you enjoy it, you'll watch it again. You'll recommend it to somebody. And then this, along the same lines of, just like what I mentioned, talking about Major Payne. Oh yeah, I love Major Payne. You get a group of people and everybody, yeah, Major Payne's great.
Right.
That's a classic to me. That's something that is like, I would say at least 80% of your generation has seen that movie,
Right.
or at least knows enough about it, because it was such a huge, popular movie that you couldn't have not seen it or known people who
Right.
saw it and talked about it enough to where you're like, yeah, I know the premise of it. Maybe I never saw it, but because it's not my thing, but I know what you're talking about.
Makes sense. I think for me, it's heavily to do with storytelling and then relevance to the time period that the movie took place, like nostalgia. Pitch Black is one of them, early 2000s. I can watch Pitch Black over and over and over, right?
So you're talking about repeatability as well.
Right, in that sense. But I say more than repeatability, just the storytelling aspect. Like we talked about, how I talked about Hellraiser Inferno, right? It's the fact that it's that Y2K 2000s vibe, like the outfits, the way it's shot, the way people dress, like how they look, how they talk. It's completely different from now. So it kind of just reminds me of how that was Batman Forever, right? We're a few years apart, but like you said, your Batman was Keaton. Mine's was technically Kilmer, kinda, like, you know what I mean? So that's the first Batman, I'd say, live action that I was exposed to, and then I saw Keaton like probably a little after that.
Really?
But yeah, like Batman Forever was it, right? And then you had the weird George Clooney stuff, right? With Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy, Uma Thurman, right?
Uma
And then we got
Thurman,
into the
yeah.
Nolan stuff, and that was more of when we were more adults, right? But
The
yeah,
darker,
it was
grittier.
Val Kilmer and Keaton for us. But yeah, it has to do a lot with the storytelling and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And then too, like I said, the direction, visually, certain things can stand out more. We talked about Seven, visually how that movie shot and where they pulled inspiration from, stuff like that. And it just really encompasses that like big city, New York, detective, serial killer, dark, murky,
It
like, you
just-
know what
by
I
the
mean?
way, it just
It's just
came
like,
out.
wow, this feels like New York in the 90s, like, you know what I mean? So, and
Mm-hmm.
it was in the 90s when they made the movie, but just stuff like that
Yeah.
sticks out to me, and I'm just like, wow, I can watch this even
Yeah.
20 years later. But the basis of it is the story good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kage?
I was gonna say, for those who haven't seen the movie Seven, it actually just showed. I don't know if it just showed up today. For those that haven't seen it, it's an older film. I think it's on HBO Max. It just got
You're talking
back.
about Brad Pitt
Yeah.
and, okay.
Mike Morgan Freeman.
Yeah, Morgan
On
Great
Max,
movie.
yeah.
I will watch that like till the end of time. It will never be bad. Old to me.
So Kage, what would you say makes a film a classic?
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. I think the story, if the story, because right now we're in the age of remakes, adaptations, and stuff like that, and the thing that makes a movie nostalgic is if the story is unique enough and it stands out, it has that's what gives it that staying power. That's what gives it its rewatchability. And so, case in point, we can go back and watch movies like Seven, like Michael Keaton Batman, best Batman, like, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's just so iconic. It's the story is so original that you can't top it. You just can't. You know what I mean? You can't mess with it. Matrix is such a strange movie, and we have a lot of movies talking about AI going rogue or whatever, but that was just so, I feel like, ahead of its time. You know, I feel like Neff would agree with me on that. He's nodding, folks. But yeah, just a really solid story. A thing I would also point out is actors. So your actors, if you have really good actors, I think that'll really stick in your mind. Not to say that it needs great AAA actors,
Yeah.
but like if your acting and your storytelling is really, really good, you're gonna remember that, and it's gonna make you want to see like Bruce Willis. Unfortunately, he's no longer acting.
It's like a legacy actor.
He's a legacy actor. You can watch a lot of Bruce Willis movies, Fifth Element, you know, all of the. God, we can go on and on just
bro, you
about
can go
Bruce
on.
Willis.
Die Hard.
Die Hard movies,
Yeah.
you know what
Pulp
I'm
Fiction.
saying? And
Pulp
it's like,
Fiction, yeah.
you can't mess with those.
Unbreakable.
Unbreakable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
so-
I mean, he's got such an extensive film
Catalog.
Right.
And I mean, most of his later films, unfortunately, have not been very good, but you know, that could be attributed to many factors, and some of the things that we see with our kind of aged actors, not necessarily being in demand anymore for the roles that they were famous for, as well as, you know, when you get to a certain age in Hollywood, we see this with male and female actors and actresses, that they just don't get as good of picks on roles. Some of them are you know, fortunate to have a huge catalog or a huge range to choose from, and others kind of get pigeonholed, and we've talked about that before. Bruce Willis, he kept making action films, just they weren't all that great. Nicolas Cage, he kept kind of making these action films. Unfortunately, most of them were not that great. But, you know, we've seen some people come in and out. Michael Caine had his time as well. He kind of faded out for a little bit, you know, and then came back and faded out again. And you know, with him, you could also make the argument that he probably was still active in England. So just like Jackie Chan we talked about, you know, in the 90s, a lot of his movies were 80s and 90s. They were big hits in the U.S. You know, Drunken Master is one of my favorites, Twin Dragons. I mean, those were dubbed ones, but then he started doing, you know, the English version, Rush Hour and Shanghai Nights. You know, those movies were big and popular, where he actually, you know, learned English to be able to do his own voice in that. And I mean, he even got his own animated series, Jackie Chan animated series, for those of you who still remember.
That. I remember that. Don't be ashamed. I watched that. I'm down with it.
But you know, I think too, with what everybody's kind of touched on with making of a classic film, I think one of the biggest things that I will point out too is that, you know, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I believe that's how that saying goes. And, you know, big in the 90s and early 2000s, we had so many movies like Scary Movie and, you know, Not Another Teen Movie and all these that were poking fun. Airplane is one of my favorite movies, and it's from the 80s, and it made fun of a series of disaster, horror, suspense-related movies that I believe were called like The Terminal or something like that. They were, you know, oh, this airplane is going to crash into the terminal or whatever, or into the airport. So that might have been what it was, might have been airport. But either way, some of those movies, I say they become classics if other movies start incorporating,
Yes, that's
you
a great
know,
point.
famous parts of it within their own things. I mean, I can I can think of at least probably half a dozen movies that put that Matrix, you know, floating backwards, you know, dodge move in, you know, as a joke. And I feel like that also leads to what could make it classic. I mean, quoting Pulp Fiction or quoting, you know, amongst your friends, quoting famous lines from these movies, those I think make them classics too. Even with like The Godfather, is like, and on the day of my daughter's wedding, you know, like, I haven't even seen them, and I can think of quotes that I've heard other people use, you know, from those movies, and I think that also leads into what makes them such a classic to other people.
Good, good. Buttons, you want to take us out on this episode?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I'm just gonna leave it with, you know, 70s and 80s movies, 90s movies. These are our childhood people. You know, old school is not bad. And, you know, I think we covered a lot of our different topics that touch on what makes these films so great, not just to us, but we'd love to hear what your favorite 70s, 80s, 90s movies, you know, what movies were so great to you, what made them classics. Please like and subscribe and give us those comments so we can see how what your favorites are as well. And that's going to do it for me. Buttons.
Neff,
Kage.
be safe.
Late.